Contrary to the way that we commonly look at it, which is that Tisha B'Av gives us the Megillah, the fact is that it is the exact opposite. The Megillah is what gives us Tisha B'Av. And so I think that it is important that we discuss the Megillah, and then perhaps through a discussion of the Megillah, we will have a different view or different approach to what it is exactly that Tisha B'Av is doing. Now there's another Megillah which starts with almost the opposite as Eicha, and that is where Shlomo HaMelech starts the Megillah of Shir HaShirim with those exact words, Shir HaShirim Asher Lishleimai. And Chazal are troubled by the repetitious expression, the repetitive expression of Shir HaShirim. And so they darshan that if all of the Shira are Kadosh, this Shir is Kodesh Kadashim. So it is not just a Shir, but it is the Shir of all Shir. That's why Chazal darshan it. But we need to approach this pasuk also in terms of Pshutei Shel Mikra. What does it mean from a Poshet Pshat, from a Poshet Taich point of view? What does this mean when we say Shir HaShirim Asher Lishleimai? Our Chachamim, when they established the Nusach HaTfilah, they composed for us a bracha that we make on the recitation of Shira. Because in Psukei de Zimra, we recite a great deal of Shira, and then at the end, we make a bracha on the recitation of that Shira. And in the composition of that bracha, we are told that one of the things that we mention is that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is Haboicher B'Shirei Zimra, which tells us that Shir is not limited to song as we are used to seeing it, because if it was, then it wouldn't need to say Haboicher B'Shirei Zimra, it would have just said Haboicher B'Shir. By telling us that it is Haboicher B'Shirei Zimra, that already tells us that there might be many different types of Shira, and the one that we happen to be making a bracha on is the type known as Shirei Zimra. And so, let's talk a little bit about the difference between Zimra as a Shira and what could perhaps be a different type of Shira. On the Posek, Mizmar La'asaf Elokim Bo Goyim Benachalosecha, so the Gemara asks, Mizmar La'asaf, why is this a Mizmar? Kina La'asaf Mibayale. The whole entire parak, that whole entire parak of Tehillim is describing Bo Goyim Benachalosecha, the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash, and Klal Yisrael going into Golus, etc. Why then does the parak open with the words Mizmar La'asaf, a song for Asaf? It should have opened up with the words Kina La'asaf, a lament to Asaf. And so the Gemara gives a very interesting answer. The Gemara answers, well, yes, but we are being mizamer, we are singing, because HaKadosh Baruch Hu was hishlich chamasai al etzim va'avonim, that Hashem vented His anger on the stones and on the woodwork of the Beis HaMikdash instead of venting it onto Klal Yisrael themselves. Therefore, the fact that HaKadosh Baruch Hu was hishlich chamasai al etzim va'avonim and not on us is cause enough, reason enough for Zimra. And that's why the parak opens with Mizmar La'asaf and not Kina La'asaf. Now this, of course, is a key to understanding Zimra, because what it's basically saying is that Zimra is the response that one has when he recognizes something which is a good thing. When we're able to appreciate something that we perceive as good, then the exclamation, the spontaneous exclamation that issues forth is what we call Zimra. It's only because of our ability to appreciate that Hashem was hishlich chamosei, that he vented his anger on the eitzim and the avonim, as opposed to being mashlichit on us, as opposed to venting that anger on us, that the appreciation of that incredible good is why instead of the parak opening with the words kina la'asaf, it opens with the word mizmar la'asaf, thus showing us that a mizmar is the type of exclamation that we would expect when someone, or when we have been able to recognize and appreciate something that is good, and that's what we are responding to. Which of course would imply that a kina is the opposite. When instead of appreciating that which is the good, we are forced to face up to something which is very devastating, then instead of it being a mizmar, it becomes a kina. Right? That was the Gemara's question. Mizmar la'asaf? That's not what it should have said. It shouldn't have said a mizmar, it should have said a lament to asaf. The answer is no. The mizmar is going on the fact that Hashem vented his anger on eitzim va'avan. That means that the mizmar comes from the appreciation of something that is good. But when what we are responding to, when what it is that is eliciting this sudden response is the fact that we've had no choice but to face up to something that is not good, but that's something that is painful and devastating, then it becomes a different thing. Then instead of it being referred to as a mizmar, now it would be referred to as a kina. Memela, you have haboicher b'shirei, and what type of shirim are we talking about? Haboicher b'shirei zimra. That type of shira, because that's the type of shira that we happen to have been saying, and that's what we are reciting the bracha on. But there is another type of shira, not the shira of zimra. It's a shira of a different form, what we would call a shira of kina, or of lament, which is also a type of shira. Memela, we could say, in terms of the pshutei shel mikra, that here's what Shlomo Melech was saying. Shir hashirim, that this is a song, but of what type? It is a song of the song type. Not that it is a shira of a different type, but is a shir. What type of shir? A shir of the shirim type. Similar to haboicher b'shirei zimra type, as opposed to a different type. And that could be said in terms of the pshutei shel mikra as to what Shlomo Melech meant when he said shir of hashir. But whether it is a shir of zimra or whether it is a shir of kina, we first have to figure out what exactly is a shira altogether. What is it that we mean when we say that we are going to be singing? And where we feel this need to make an exclamation, a need to express something that comes out. One could almost use the word a involuntary expression of something that we call shira, the need to sing or the need to... What exactly is shira? And so, in order for us to get an understanding of that, we have to review something that we have spoken about in the past, but nonetheless warrants repetition, either for those who have not yet heard it, or even for those who have, but that review is always good, and ein beis hamedrash b'lo chidush, maybe this time you'll hear it in a different way and you'll understand it differently. But regardless, we have to review the issue in order to get a handle on the concept of shira. Our divrei nevuah are handed over to us, have been handed over to us. Yes, it's being recorded. Our divrei nevuah have been handed over to us in 3 different books, if we call them that. And we refer to this as Tanakh, Torah, Nevi'im, and Ksuvim. And each one of these categories, if we call it that, in addition to being different in terms of the nevuah that is being utilized in their composition, each one of these categories, the Torah, the Nevi'im, and the Ksuvim, each one of them is coming to describe something which is not the other. They may all be joined into one, but each one is describing something which is very, very different than the other, hence the different svarim. And in order for us to appreciate this, I want to start with a mashal. There is a concept called the union of marriage. This is a concept. This is a concept that has halachic perimeters, what we call a chalais. A chalais is when a certain legal machination has been performed, a new thing has been created, and that new thing that has been created is called the union. And this union has halachic perimeters. That's a concept. When somebody takes advantage of these halachic legal mechanisms and creates the chalais that we call the union, then he starts living the life of that union. Now you understand that the life that is being led within that union is not the same thing as the concept of the union, right? There's the concept with its perimeters, with its halachic mechanisms, but then there's the actual living of it, which very often could look a lot different than the high concepts of the concept. If you would say to somebody, what is the high concept of marriage? I would say, man and a woman, they create a bond, and they never fight, and they always agree to everything, and life is rosy, and everything is wonderful. Yeah. Okay. Now could we be realistic, please? That is to say that the living of the life is not the same thing as the concept. The concept is a concept with all of its legal perimeters. It's a concept, a union of marriage. But then there's the living of the life. And the living of the life has its ups and it has its downs. It has its disappointments. It has its good times. It has its bad times. But that's real life. You are living that dry concept known as the union of marriage. And it very often looks a lot different than the ideas, the high concepts of the union of marriage. In addition to that, you also have the sensations that emerge from having lived this union. You have what we would call love, devotion, dedication, care. These are all things that emerge when two people have been living the concept. Does everybody hear the three very, very distinct parts of this? In exactly the same way, the Nimshal. The Torah is a description of the Ratzon HaBorei. It's a box within which we have an accurate, total description of the Ratzon HaBorei in Olam Hazeh. Now, the high concepts of that, of course, are that we always get along, and we always agree, and everything is rosy. But when you're living that high concept, it's not necessarily going to be that way. There's going to be its ups, there's going to be its downs, the disappointments, great things that happen, the terrible things that happen. When one is living the life of being the Am HaNivchar, who are attempting to live this union with the Borei. And so the Torah corresponds in our mashal to the concept. The Nevi'im are a description of what does real life look like when one is living in that union. When the Am HaNivchar is living with the Borei within the context of that high concept called the Ratzon HaBorei. And it has its good times and its bad times. It's got its rough spots and it's got its great spots. It's got its disappointments and it has its great moments. It's living the real life. That's what the Nevi'im are coming to describe. What does a world in which I am living that Ratzon HaBorei, what does that look like? What is that? And that's what Nevi'im are describing, both the Nevi'im Rishonim and Nevi'im Achrei. Ksuvim is coming to describe the sensations that emerge from that. The emerging realities that come from having lived that life with the Borei. All of those things, the love and the dedication, the sense of loss, the sense of gain, all of those things are being expressed, for these are emerging sensations that come when one has lived that life described in the concept of the Ratzon HaBorei. And so our Torah, Nevi'im, and Ksuvim are a one whole that describes in full this union. The concept, the living of that concept, and what we would call real time, and then also the sensations that emerge, what comes from that. If I have to give a description of what is coming from that, what has emerged from living with, having a real life together with the Borei. And that's what Ksuvim is coming to do. Shira is exactly that. Shira is the tool that one uses to be able to describe that which really is very difficult to describe. How do I describe the emerging reality that comes from having lived a life of marriage? And so we very often resort to song to be able to describe and to express the inexpressible. Just think about it. All of the songs that people write, what are they about? The love, the loss, the hurt, the gain, the pleasure. That's what it's all about. We are attempting to use song as a way to describe that which is otherwise very, very difficult to describe. Because what it's coming to describe is always an emerging reality that comes from having lived the life of this concept. And so that is what Shira is. Shira Zimra, or when I am utilizing Shira to describe the wonders that have emerged from this. But there's another type of Shira called Kina, which also is a description of the sense of loss and disappointment that comes together also with one who has lived in this union. And don't kid yourself. The mashal is great because marriage is full of that. There is this very often where a person will want to say a kina on the things that have happened in the marriage. And that doesn't mean that the marriage has been broken. It just means that there have been and there has been a sense of loss and disappointment within the context of us living together. Which is why HaKadosh Baruch Hu is able to say in the Torah, Va'af gam zois, v'yoisam be'eretz oivehem loy ma'astim v'loy ga'altim l'chaloisam lohafer brisi itam. Because that bris, that bond has not been severed. with all the losses and with all the disappointments and with all of the devastating facts and with all of the terrible things that have both been done and have been done onto us, the bond has not been broken. Our bond to the Beirei and his bond to us has not been severed in the slightest. There has not been a haforas habris. The bris between Klal Yisrael and Hashem is still as strong as it was. It's just that living this life, this is one of the emerging realities. There are its good times and its bad times. There are the disappointments and when things didn't go as they should have. In the same way that there are wonderful things that happen. And so Shlomo HaMelech in Shir HaShirim is describing the wonderful things that are emerged, that have emerged from us living this union with the Beirei. And Eicha is coming to describe the emerging reality of the loss and the disappointing things that have happened in our living this life with the Beirei. But both of them are forms of Shira. And Ksuvim in general is an attempt at that, to be able to describe in words the various emerging realities that come from Klal Yisrael, the Am HaNivchar, having not only accepted the high concepts of the Ratzon HaBeirei, but actually have, in their attempt to live a life according to those concepts. And so this is the introduction to understanding the whole concept behind the idea of there being a kina versus there being a shira. Which means that Eicha was written not only to express the historical events that happened, which it does, but more importantly, Eicha was written as a way of being able to lament, to describe the emerging reality of the disappointing parts of our living this life, of this union that exists between us and the Beirei, based on that high concept called the Ratzon HaBeirei. And understanding that will, of course, give us a very different view of how we should approach Eicha altogether. Because we tend to view Eicha as being a description of horrible events. And I'm not denying that there is a description of horrible events in the Megillah, but that's not its point. Its point is to describe the realities that have come to be as a result of certain disappointing events, disappointing conduct, a great deal of loss that has emerged between us and the Beirei in our living of this life. We have a rocky marriage. I think that's the term that they use, right? A rocky marriage. But the bond is still there. Don't kid yourself. The bond is still there. So the bond is still there. Nonetheless, there is an emerging reality that has come from the conduct, the interaction, etc., for which the Megillah now gives words to express that which is otherwise indescribable. And so now I want to start spreading out the Megillah for us. The Megillah is made up of 4 main sections, which correspond, not coincidentally, to the 4 prakim that the Megillah is made up of. Now, there is a 5th parak, but the 5th parak is fundamentally different, and we'll get to that later. But there are 4 main prakim in the Megillah, And there are four main parts to the Megillah, each one corresponding to a different element. And I want to give titles to each one of these parts. Parts 1 and 2 is what I would call the descriptive. Part 3 is what I would call the lament. And part 4 is what I would call the appendix. And if you look at not only what is being described in the parts, but if you look at the tone of what is being described in the parts, you will notice that they differ from each other very, very significantly. And now we're going to break it down perek by perek, which really is just another way of saying we're going to break it down part by part so that we can appreciate what it is that the Megillah is giving us. When one looks at perek Aleph, or part Aleph, you will notice a very interesting pattern. And that is that every pasuk, or every grouping of psukim, can be divided into two sections, the first and the second. And the first focuses on the events as they happened to Klal Yisrael, while as the second focuses on the effect that that has in the context of all the other Ummah Yisrael. Let's take the first pasuk as an example. Eicha yashva badad ha'ir rabasi am haisa ka'almana. That's describing something that affects Klal Yisrael. The next part of the same pasuk, Rabasi bagoyim sarasi bamdinais haisa lamas. That's describing Klal Yisrael in the context of the Ummah Yisrael. Next pasuk, B'chay sivke balayla v'dimasa al lechya ein lo menachem mikol ohavea. That's describing what happened to Klal Yisrael. Kol ro'eh bagdu ba hayulala oivim. That's describing it in the context of the Ummah Yisrael. You go through the perek, pasuk by pasuk, and you will see that this pattern does not stop. The first part of the pasuk describes something that is on Klal Yisrael, it's affecting Klal Yisrael, and the second part of the pasuk is describing that exact thing just in the context of the Ummah Yisrael. Now, we're not used to seeing things this way, but it is clear from this first perek that there is an element here that needs to be appreciated. And this element I call a graph, which is usually a mirror of events. Everybody knows what a graph is. It goes up, 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 and then it can go down, and then up, 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 and down, etc. That's what a graph looks like. Klal Yisrael has a graph that heads upwards. And it is a graph of Klal Yisrael's station among the Goyim, what we call the Am HaNivcha. Or the way that Bilam put it, Hein Am Levadat Yishkein Uva Goyim Lo Yischashav. Where Klal Yisrael sits on a pinnacle, almost hovering over the rest of the Goyim. It is a station in which they are considered almost untouchable. Not only untouchable from a violence point of view, but they're considered to be like this magical, majestic, noble thing to which we can only look up to and pay homage to. That's what we call Am Levadad Yishkeinu V'Goyim Lo Yischashad. Then events happen, and as a consequence of those events, the graph takes a sharp turn downwards. And now Klal Yisrael becomes the most degraded and disgraced nation on the planet. What Chazal referred to as Mi Igla Rama Labira Amikta, from the highest pinnacles to the deepest depths, a crash. This graph is what is being described in Perek Aleph, the collapse of the magic known as Klal Yisrael. The collapse of the fact that Klal Yisrael was looked up to as not just being something unique, but as being something that was so untouchable, so special, so magical. The Am HaNivchar, universally recognized as being the Am HaNivchar. No two ways about it, no question about it, no arguments. Then events happen, and because of the events that have happened, it crashes, it collapses. And so instead of us being this untouchable, almost sublime thing called the Am HaNivchar, we now become the opposite. Ki hayinu la'az v'keles bagoy. Nechshavnu katzoin latevach yuva, lahareg, ula'abed, ulamaka, ulacherpa. Shiktsunu ketumas hanida, ad masai uzecho bashvi v'sifartecho biyad sar. That idea of oz and tiferes gone. And now we're like shkotzim. The station of Klal Yisrael, the status of Klal Yisrael has collapsed. That's Perek Aleph. And that's why Perek Aleph is constantly juxtaposing it, the events, to in the context of the Ummah Sa'ilah. Because it is in a mirror to the events that have happened that the graph has taken this collapsed direction downwards. Perek Beis doesn't have any of that. Perek Beis speaks about events that have happened to Klal Yisrael, but not in a very specific form, in a more vague, ambiguous form. But it doesn't describe at all relative to the Ummah Sa'ilah. That whole pattern that we see in Perek Aleph does not exist in any of the other prakim. That's because Perek Beis is describing an entirely different part. It's describing the collapse of the structure of Klal Yisrael. Klal Yisrael works according to a certain structure. Not only do we have a Melech at the top, and a Kohen Gadol at the top, and a Beis Hamikdash at the top, but there's a whole underneath structure to how Klal Yisrael works. Lahavdil, in our communities, there's a structure to how communities work. And it's based on certain things. Perek Beis is describing the collapse of the structure of Klal Yisrael, the nation as a nation of Klal Yisrael. So indeed, although both prakim, Aleph and Beis, are addressing the Am, they're addressing the Am from very different points of view. Perek Aleph is addressing the Am from the point of view of the station of the Am, the status of the Am, and Perek Beis is describing the Am in terms based on that which has been inflicted upon it, sort of as of the disintegration of the sense of the Am. So yes, they are both descriptive, for they are both making use of, through describing events in a very vague term. Eicha yashva badad ha'ir Abbas Yam is a vague thing. It's not saying what actually happened, right? It's a vague description. Eicha yu'am hazahav is a vague description. Nonetheless, it is utilizing describing events as a means to express what it is that it is showing. The collapse of the station of Klal Yisrael, and then the collapse of the nation of Klal Yisrael, its disintegration as a nation. Those two descriptive things then lead us to Perek Gimel, which, if you look at the structure of the Perek, is so strange and so different than the others that you can't help but to be pulled up and to stop. Now the psukim become short. And instead of it being a solid aleph beis, it is a thrice recited aleph beis. And they're punches, each pasuk. Short, abrupt, and a punch to the gut. Because Perek Gimel is exactly that. It is a lament. It is a crying out that is the expression of the sense of what Prakim Aleph and Beis have meant. And what do Prakim Aleph Beis mean? I'll tell you what it means. It means that Klal Yisrael has entered into a reality which can be described as a big black hole that is held in place only by an outer shell of dreams and aspirations and miracles. But other than that, you are in a void. A terrible, terrible void. For thousands of years, you talk about Yerushalayim, you don't know what Yerushalayim is. You talk about a Beis HaMikdash, you don't know what a Beis HaMikdash is. You talk about a Melech, you talk about, there's nothing. Nothing. For thousands of years, Klal Yisrael had a void. Everything about their existence was a big void. The only thing that held it together was like this vague dream. That's what held it together. Had it not been for the fact that we had the nevuahs that gave us that enclosing frame of dreams, and had it not been for the incredible miracles that held us together, that void would have spread and it would have totally consumed us. But do you know what that means when I say a void? A nothing. A total and utter nothing. You have nothing except for your dreams. And so void is not really the best word, more like black hole is the best word. We nowadays have a very hard time even being able to imagine that, because in our lifetime, that void has gotten smaller, it has contracted, and the outer shell of what used to be dreams and miracles has gotten greater and greater. Now you talk about Eretz Yisrael, we all know what Eretz Yisrael is. Now you talk about Yerushalayim, we all know what Yerushalayim is. Now you talk about Kibbutz Goliath, we all know what Kibbutz Goliath is. Now you talk about Mashiach's coming, we all know what that means. So we have a very hard time even relating to the void, because in our lifetime, the void has contracted. It's still there, but it has so incredibly contracted because it's been pushed more and more into a contraction state by the fact that what used to be dreams have now become realities. And the more the dreams turn into realities, the more the void contracts. And the more dreams turn into realities, the more that will contract even further. Until at a certain point, those dreams will become such a reality that there will be no void left. Which is, of course, when Mashiach will come. So we have a hard time even relating to that void. But imagine, just try to put yourself into the thousands of years of Golus. What did Klal Yisrael have? A void. A void. Nothing. No Eretz Yisrael, no Yerushalayim, no Beis HaMikdash, no Gilui Shechina. Just this dream that one day we'll have it. We read the pasuk Lulei Teirascha Sha'ashuai Oz Avadati Ba'ani, and we wonder what did David HaMelech mean. That's what he means. Without the Torah, they mamish would have been lost. Because there's nothing. You have nothing. You understand what that means to have absolutely nothing? It's an indescribable void. And so Perek Gimel comes and puts words to that void. But that's what Tisha B'Av is. Tisha B'Av is the ability to recognize, to sense, and to be sensitive to that void. You wonder how people are sad on Tisha B'Av? It's not sad. It's far more than sad. It's devastating. I'm not sad because the Beis HaMikdash got destroyed. But we as an Am are devastated by the fact that all has collapsed. Even the events that are described in Perek Aleph, which lead to this part of the void, even that we have a hard time dealing and relating to, because we don't feel that way anymore. Because indeed, we're on the up curve of that graph. Klal Yisrael is climbing its way back up to where it will once again be that sublime, untouchable, magical Am HaNivchar. So even that element, we have a hard time relating to. Just because it's contracted more. Because we are living in the era of Bias Mashiach. So we do have a harder time relating. Nonetheless, the Megillah is describing the devastation that created this incredible void. Perek Daled is perhaps the one that we relate to the most, and yet I refer to it as the appendix. Because Perek Daled is the one that we wish that the whole Megillah would be made up of. Descriptions of the actual horrors inflicted. The hunger, the starvation, the murder, the killing, the burning, the pillaging, the raping. Yeah, that we can relate to. Oh, that's good stuff. And bad stuff. But that's good Tisha B'Av stuff. Let's talk about millions of people being gassed. That will get me going. But it's only the appendix. Because that's not the void. Is that not a consequence of Churban? That there will also be all of that? Murder, starvation, rape, pillage? Of course. But it's an appendix to the Megillah. It's because of the void that all of that happens. We have an easier time relating to the appendix for the simple reason that our void has contracted. Nonetheless, it's just an appendix, which is why it comes after Perek Gimel. Perek Gimel is really the closure of the Megillah. because the Megillah is describing the void. For Tisha B'Av itself is an appreciation of that void. The appendix to it is all of the horrors, the actual individual horrors that were experienced. Experienced both in terms of the days of the Churban and throughout Golus. But they're individual experiences. They're not the experiences that make up the devastation of the Am. They're the individual experiences. They're not the Am's destruction. They're not the collapse of the Am. They're each individual's personal horrors that he experienced. Now, I'm not minimizing those horrors, and certainly not when they are horrors on a collective level. Nonetheless, they are just an appendix to the Megillah. I think that being able to see the Megillah in this way allows us to note that we don't read the Megillah because it's Tisha B'Av, but rather it is Tisha B'Av because we have read the Megillah. And that simple difference in approach, I think, is a operative difference in terms of how we come to try to understand what it is that we're supposed to be gaining through the Moed called Tisha B'Av. We're not meant to merely appreciate all the terrible things that have happened. Those are merely consequences. The point of Tisha B'Av is to allow us, through recognizing the void and mourning the disappointments and the loss that is being described, which is what brought this void into being, in the ability to appreciate that, we give more weight to that outer frame called the dreams and miracles, which allows Klal Yisrael to exist throughout all of its years of Golus, until indeed that void is no longer, and all we have are the dreams that have become realities and the miracles. I wish you all a very useful Tisha B'Av, and I hope I will see you all next Sunday. Are there any questions?
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
You mentioned chapter 5, that you would get to it.
Yes. The problem is that we have run out of time. We'll have to do that next year.
We won't need it next year.
No, next year we'll still have chapter 5.
Oh, right, we will. We'll do it during the Tisha B'Av Seder. Okay.
No, chapter 5 is the chapter that deals with the reality when this void has been filled in. Which is why I have no problem waiting till next year, because that will be the only chapter left.
Okay.
You could also listen to the shir if you want. There's a recording of the shir. I'll send it to you. Aaron Levy will send it to you.
On nested truths? Nice.
I don't know how he'll send it to you. He'll send it to you somehow.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Guys, have a good week. Have a good Tisha B'Av. I hope this helps you appreciate Tisha B'Av more. I will speak to you all next Sunday.
Thank you.
Baruch, Rabbi.
Thanks so much, Rabbi.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Pleasure. See you all.